I'm Jonathan Ochshorn. This is part 6 in a series of lectures dealing with health, safety, and welfare in buildings, and in particular, how those aspects of functionality and utility can be constrained by politics and economics and damaged by expression. Part 6 deals with the politics and expression of sustainability. This is sustainability, which is obviously a huge topic, and we'll just scratch the surface. This is like recent news, just to show you that the global capitalist order is totally screwed up. Pretty much you can go to any newspaper on any day, in any month, in any year, and find similar headlines. It's just a never-ending parade of bad news. And it's always the same, well, not always. Sometimes there actually are natural disasters. But most of the time, even the natural disasters cause problems because of, like, let's say the earthquake recently in Turkey. Yes, it's a natural disaster, but the extent of the death and injury and property loss is about humans that are cutting corners and saving money and not doing the right thing. So this is just the underlying context for a discussion of sustainability. This is the world we're in. In this world, you get people like E.O. Wilson, who's a very famous, I think basically an entomologist. I think his original research had to do with ants, the world's foremost expert on ants, but he also gets involved with ecological issues. And he wrote this book fairly recently called Half Earth, where he says, basically, we're destroying ourselves. And from his standpoint, maybe even more importantly, we're destroying so many of the species on the planet. And it's because of human intervention and the way humans have destroyed all of the places that animals and other species need for their survival. And so his idea is that, well, if we want to survive and if we want to keep a biodiverse planet, we have to basically devote half the earth, half the land mass, half the water mass to non-humans. Just take half the earth and say, this is for you, and we'll take the other half. But the thing is, when you read the book, of course, this makes sense. He's like a scientist. The scientific logic is credible. The problem is that he doesn't have a very sophisticated political argument for how you do this. He has a couple of sentences like, yeah, I understand there's private property, but maybe we can get the owners of the private property to somehow allow so-called non-use of their property. Right. There's another book by the lawyer Jan Latos called The Right of Non-Use, which has the same kind of idea, recognizing the same sort of problem, noticing that humans are making the planet uninhabitable, not only for ourselves, but for all of these other species. And so he wants land itself to have the right of non-use. Typically, when you think of rights, you think of humans that have rights. He wants to give land that right. But neither Latos nor Wilson really acknowledges the problem with the private ownership of property. And this, again, goes back to Thomas Hobbes and his ideology, where property and your ability to divide up the whole planet and own it as a private parcel, where that is fundamental. And neither Latos nor Wilson overcomes that. So they end up with that kind of contradiction of not really explaining how it is that owners of private property will relinquish the right to use their property. We come to the LEED green building rating system. I'm going to talk a little bit about LEED because it's the biggest certifier of green buildings in the world. They have a bunch of reference guides. We'll talk mainly about the guide for building design and construction. They have reference guides for schools, for who knows what, they have maybe 10 of them for different aspects of, but this is the main one for your normal institutional or commercial or even large residential buildings. It gives you advice on the utilitarian functionality that creates a sustainable building. And they are proudly voluntary, that it has no force of law. They call themselves market-driven, which is a kind of a branding, a way of saying that you're profit-driven without using the nasty word profit. Markets, you think of like nice little, like the farmer's market or something. Everybody loves markets. So they use the word market-driven. But when you see that word, think of rapacious capitalists that are only after money. and consensus-based, which means they want to integrate a lot of different parties who have an interest in sustainability. Some are environmentalists, some are builders, all sorts of different people involved. So you're going to end up with a kind of compromise, which is maybe explains why it's been so successful. It's divided into 6 main chapters or sections dealing with various aspects of sustainability: location, transportation, sustainable sites, water efficiency, energy and atmosphere. That's the big one. If you want to know where global warming is coming, that's energy and atmosphere. You have materials and resources. So there's a carpet in the front of this building. I'm standing on it. Has anyone ever seen any other carpet in Milstein Hall? This is it. And guess what? They got a point because it's a sustainable carpet. So this is how people game the system. They put silly things in, not because they want them, but because they can get a lead point by doing it. The thing about LEED, you can criticize each of these chapters and find contradictions and inconsistencies, and I've done that. But what I want to emphasize is that the LEED manuals are constantly worrying about the rate of return that is implied by any potential sustainable action. That is what they mean by saying they're a market-driven, have a market-driven strategy. The underlying premise is that really sustainability makes economic sense, and people acting in their own interest will do the right thing and be sustainable if only they knew how much money they could save. And of course, that's not true. It's precisely this interest in profitability that has caused all of the problems that LEED purports to address. So it's an ideology. And if you look deeply into the LEED manual, you'll see that when they have to do things that are not profitable, they kind of make exceptions to even their own rule, or they look to government to subsidize things. So, it's a kind of a market-driven attitude, but with all sorts of contradictions and inconsistencies. LEED has really no interest in anything much further beyond the individual building. They're not interested in regional planning, certainly not in a global agreement amongst the people in the world to deal with environmental issues in a systematic and sensible way. That is not on their agenda at all. Basically, they evaluate one building at a time, and everything else is really not of interest. So it turns into pretty much a corporate branding tool. So the Bank of America Tower near Bryant Park, near the 42nd Street Library, if you've been in Manhattan, you may know the building. The first LEED Platinum core shell project. So core shell it's lingo for designing an office building or a speculative office building where you're not really designing all of the floors for the tenants. So in a lot of speculative office buildings, you have the so-called core with the elevators and the shell with the curtain wall. And then basically everybody who rents space will bring in their own architect. You don't have to design the whole building. There's another LEED guide manual just for core shell. And that's what this was, Platinum. Platinum is the highest rating. And yet, recently, it turned out that New York City's climate law, which is requiring that buildings upgrade or pay penalties in order to be more sustainable, that this platinum rated building was flunking the climate law. But it's, to my mind, worse than that, because LEED has no interest not only in really what the building is doing in terms of global warming or burning fossil fuels, but it has no interest in what's going on in the building. You could be doing nasty things in this building, and LEED has no interest in even knowing. So for example, the Bank of America turns out, as you can see in this Sierra Club article, between 2016 and 2021, it provided $232 billion in lending and underwriting to the fossil fuel industry, 4th among global banks. So that's what they're doing in their Platinum building, is they're subsidizing and funding and enabling fossil fuel companies. It's a branding tool. That's why they do it. I mean, really, a LEED rated gas station, and yes, it is a LEED rated gas station. It's got to be in Los Angeles. I was just in Los Angeles and I neglected to go find it. My next trip, I'll certainly go there. And you know, when you read about this wonderful gas station, you find out that there's 90 solar panels to reduce energy consumption by 16%. And there's cacti on the roof. And the bathroom walls are made from farmed wood and rapidly renewing bamboo. This is the kind of stuff that LEED encourages, so that you can brand yourself as a sustainable gas station. Another really problematic aspect of LEED in terms of measuring energy is that they don't actually measure energy. They measure what they call energy cost, because remember, this is a market-driven, a profit-driven design specification. And the way they measure the energy cost isn't by actually measuring the energy cost, but it's by comparing the modeled cost. So this is not the real cost. This is, you know, you make a model of the building and you project what the cost will be. And then you compare it to what is called a baseline building. This image is some software company that automates the creation of the LEED baseline. But in a nutshell, the baseline building is your building, basically the same geometry, but you take out everything that makes sense from a sustainable standpoint, and you make it the most generic, bare bones building possible that just meets the building code standards for energy. So for example, they instruct you to put windows on all 4 elevations equally. Don't account for the orientation. Have the least good windows that are, you know, has the least thermal resistance or the most conductance, but still satisfy the building code. So that's your baseline building. It's the building you've designed, but making it as terrible as possible, but still barely legal. You compare your building to the baseline building, and that's how you measure your energy cost, and that's how you get points under that category. In defense of OMA, when they started this building design, there was no mandate that they make it a sustainable building. It wasn't on their radar. And as I said, with respect to the Cornell architects' interest in accessibility, they had the same interest in sustainability. They held it in contempt. They didn't want to even hear the word. I remember there was a dean at the time that suggested that maybe we should make this a sustainable building. And he was just kind of laughed at by the architecture faculty. So this is our legacy here at Cornell. But between the start of the design in Milstein Hall and the end, Cornell as an institution decided that all of their buildings needed to apply for and obtain LEED certification. So the building was already designed, but then they just had to find some consultant to gather all of those points, hence the carpet, get the points and get the gold rating. But if you look at Cornell's own analysis of their LEED buildings, they had their own standards that had nothing to do with LEED that were much more sensible, which is that they actually have a target for how much energy they want to save. And you can see a lot of these other new buildings that were built had some serious energy reduction, 29%, 53%, 31%. And then if you look at what was at the time called Paul Milstein Hall, now it's just Milstein Hall, they barely met the minimum standards of the building code. And I think they only met that standard because 2 of the facades are adjacent to Sibley and Rand, so that they don't actually have any heat loss through those facades. Otherwise, they would probably not even meet the minimum standards. And you can see that at the time they were getting a silver rating. But if you look, I just saw this, I think yesterday or the day before. I never saw this plaque before. It's in Sibley, and it's got a gold rating, right? Where does it say that? Yeah, gold. So bicycle racks, carpet, and everybody's going to try to find those extra points to just up their rating, and that's what Milstein did. Not even following the LEED standards, like they cheated. For example, that bicycle rack doesn't meet the LEED standards, and yet they got a point for it. There is a little shower there, but it doesn't meet the LEED standards. It's too far away, and it's not open 24/7. The LEED requires that the shower be accessible whenever the building's open. So they cheated. They just say that's our shower, but it wasn't really compliant with the LEED guidelines to get a point there. So this is what you get. You get this kind of branding. The image on the left I took at the Martin Y. Tang Welcome Center Maybe some of you were welcomed here when you were in high school and you wanted your tour. I don't know. This is Cornell's way of saying we are a sustainable campus. Look at this gorgeous roof. And if you look at the gorgeous roof now, which everybody knew at the time, you can't maintain this pattern of red and green sedums in this 2 inches of what they call an engineered soil medium. It's not even soil. Nature will take its course. Beyond that, they had to destroy the roof a couple of times because it's perennially leaking. And they redid half the roof at great expense. And of course, they're not going to put back those sedums. There's probably like 25,000 individual plants that were put in by hand. Are you going to do that again? Probably not. And so this is what we get. This is the direct measurement of carbon dioxide from 2005 to 2022. And you see what's happening with all of the great success of the LEED rating system and the fact that they're the biggest in the world and they've got, you can see it, none of this matters. The only time you sometimes get little dips is when you have economic recessions and production of global warming gases stops, and then it just goes right back. And if you've been reading the news, you know that they're going to start drilling for more oil in Alaska. It's never-ending bad news, and it shouldn't be a surprise. Because as long as something is profitable, and as long as states and corporations and individuals are competing on the basis of profitability, you could say they have no choice. Because if they start doing the right thing for the environment, all of a sudden, someone else is going to have a less cost of production because they will be using fossil fuels rather than something more expensive and will drive you out of business. Let's do the more lighthearted examination of the expression of sustainability. And this is really a subjective judgment. How do you make a building look like it's sustainable? It's a completely ridiculous question that I'm posing to myself, but yet I've determined in my own mind that there's 2 broad expressive tropes for buildings that want to convey the notion of sustainability. And the first one is nature. In all sorts of manifestations, whether you're using heavy timber or mass timber or rapidly renewing bamboo or green roofs or plants along the walls, or even introducing sunlight into the building. A lot of these things make no sense in terms of actual sustainability, but they evoke, in some cases, more of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where humans were closer to nature. And so it's very evocative. But there's no particular reason to suspect that any of these gestures make anything in the world more sustainable if we're talking about the problems besetting us in terms of biodiversity, global warming, and a host of other problems. And again, just read the newspaper and you'll discover the problems. You'll discover that the water is polluted, the air is polluted, there's forever chemicals everywhere. It's just never ending. The other trope, I think, is technology. Rather than evoking nature, you evoke the power of technology, photovoltaic walls, sophisticated light shelves, and all of the other kinds of highly technical elements that can, in principle, save you energy. We're going to talk about a book, and this is our last section, by William McDonough. He was an A.D. White professor at Cornell, but that's not why he's famous. He's famous for being Mr. Sustainability. He was an architect. He was one of the first gurus of sustainability, advocating for green buildings, building many of them himself. And he wrote this book with his office called the Hanover Principles, which was a set of design guidelines for the Hanover World Expo in the year 2000. He was hired to tell the participants in this fair how they can make their buildings sustainable. And he has 9 principles that he outlines in the book called maxims, which are intended to inspire the participants, and they're all very idealistic. So they deal not with the reality of building constrained by profitability and competition, but rather a kind of a fantasy landscape purported to be, quote, based on the enduring elements of earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. And these terms foreshadow a resistance, a denial, a denigration of actually looking at things from a scientific or logical standpoint. I just took a few out of many, many quotes from the book to try to illustrate what I mean by this. No one knows the right answers to the challenge of sustainability as of yet. So this is a kind of the sense of hopelessness. Don't even try. Nobody knows the right answers. Quality of life needs to be implied in the design itself, not legislated by a set of rules. He doesn't want a list of rules. He doesn't want any kind of planning. He wants it to just be evocative, to express, to look to nature rather than to our own logic as thinking humans. The built fabric of our world encourages us to imagine that we comprehend systems more complex than we can ever know. So don't even try, right? It's too hard. The idea of efficiency, of minimizing this or maximizing that, reinforces the limitations of mechanistic thinking, which imagines everything we do or experience to be part of a quantifiable system. So you get the idea, right? Everything that attempts to be rational, to set goals, to plan, those are the bad things. Instead, the text extols, quote, the unplanned, the fortuitous, the places evolved without any imposed and directing idea, end quote. The evidence is clear from our record. This in the 20th century, claims to plan all aspects of the environment have failed. So in other words, planning itself is the culprit rather than the capitalist exploitation of natural and human resources. A lot of this logic ought to be familiar to you because it's an ideology that's very pervasive in so-called postmodern thought. It's the idea also of selling an idea by appealing to emotions, the idea of a didactic or expressive function for green buildings, which is consistent with this market-driven ideology that views any form of rational planning as a threat to the existing capitalist order. Because if you start looking at things rationally, all of a sudden you discover that nothing in the way the system works makes sense. And so you will attempt to overcome it. So rather than dealing with this notion of actually doing things that make sense, which challenge the existing order, you try to sell an idea by appealing to emotions. It's not accidental that expression is prioritized, and this anti-rational bias permeates McDonough's text, emphasizing the fallibility and limitations of human knowledge, and especially of social planning. What is needed, according to McDonough, is not a scientific understanding and organization of human society in relation to its environmental context, but rather a kind of poetry that might find, quote, the truth of an integrative kind of beauty, which is so impossible to describe. And this anti-rational sentiment, as I implied earlier, is hardly unique to the Hanover principles. Our former dean here at AAP, Anthony Vidler, who is an architectural theorist and critic, he identified this anti-modern discourse, and I'm quoting, since the early 1930s, which has been gaining ground with critics, skeptical of progress, in scare quotes, and its supposed benefits. Philosophers on both the right and left of the political spectrum contributed to this sensibility, from Theodor Adorno, Martin Heidegger, Max Horkheimer, Hans Sedlmayr, which amounted to no less than a concerted attack on the founding premises of modernism, that is, which had at least gave lip service to this idea of functionality and rationality. He's talking about architecture, but the same kind of anti-rational notion permeates all aspects of our culture, and you're in the middle of it now, which is why it's very hard to criticize this kind of idea because people don't want to hear it. My favorite quote from the book, by far, and that's why I've highlighted it in blue font. Sustainability is nothing new. Business and industry have always hoped that whatever course they choose will be the sustainable course, one that will not push them out of business. In a sense, there's no practical need to scold business too much. If environmental considerations are something that can really be addressed, they have to encourage business activity rather than forbid it. Now, it is hard, this is me speaking, to overemphasize the disingenuousness of this argument, which conflates the sustainable well-being of humans and the natural world. with the unforgiving competitive drive of capitalist businesses to survive and succeed by exploiting and damaging humans and the natural world in ways that have brought about grinding poverty and a planet at the brink of environmental catastrophe. The attitude, I think, summed up brilliantly in this cartoon from the New Yorker. Can't we just dye the smoke green? This is the attitude of greenwashing that is so brilliantly captured here. That's it. Thank you.